What you're going to see tonight is some cognitive science and some politics and the relationship between them. And I want to start off with a bit of a mystery. So let's get, I have the thing here that gets this started. Yes. Here we go. All right. This has to do with the Obama healthcare plan. And if you look at the provisions of the Obama healthcare plan, before Obama was inaugurated, I called up a friend who was doing his polling at the time, and they were polling on what should go into the healthcare plan. And what they found was that they picked a lot of things that had huge support, between high 60s to the 80th percentile for each of the policies that would go into this healthcare plan. So they wanted something with broad public support, policy by policy, and they got it. However, the plan as a whole did not have that much support. So the question is, why should it be that each of the policies has huge support, but the plan as a whole didn't? How did that happen? And it's, a lot of people think it's a mystery. It isn't, but you'll see why shortly. This is from David Axelrod. Axelrod sent this out to all of the people on the Obama email network the day after Obama gave a talk on 24 features of his plan, which he gave to, and this was just before the summer recess in 2009, just before the Tea Party was about to go out and attack everybody talking about this. And he gave all of the features of the plan, and then Axelrod came along and he said, hey, look, let's get the facts out there. Let's tell them exactly what's going on. There are 24 major things that you need to know, but just so you remember them easily, let's give you 3 groups of 8. Right? Now, any cognitive scientist will tell you nobody's going to remember the 3 groups of 8, but let's test you on it. Did you remember the 3 groups of 8? That is, how does this provide security and stability for those without coverage? What are the myths? Why do we need them? And here are here's the first 8. It ends, it is a list of all the things that it ends, all the negatives, right? Discrimination of pre-existing conditions, exorbitant out-of-pocket expenses, cost sharing for preventive care, etc. These are the features of the plan, defined largely in terms of what it's against. Then, and they didn't understand why people didn't understand that. Then there were myths, and what they do is here, under the myths, they give everything that attacks the plan. Right? So you're saying, here are all the things I'm going to tell you, give you this nice list, and make sure you tell everyone you talk to about how the plan is being attacked. Here it is. Those are the 8. And then here are the reasons we need it now, and here they are. Right? Now, you all remember those, right? The 3 groups of 8. Now, it turns out they took this from a particular, what I'll call a frame, we'll talk about that in a bit, of healthcare plans. It's the healthcare plan frame. That is, when you need to find out what's in your healthcare plan, you go look it up, or you check it out. That's it. Now, the conservatives never attacked any of those provisions. You never heard any conservative come out and say, yes, there should be preconditions. No, you should not be able to put your college-age student on your plan. No conservative ever came out and said anything about that. What they did was something smart. What they did was they shifted the frame. And they shifted it from details of the healthcare plan to morality. And they had 2 moral principles, freedom and life. Freedom is government takeover. Life is death panels. And they repeated government takeover, death panels, government takeover, death panels, over and over. And what happened was people loved, as soon as you asked anybody about any of the provisions, they would love it. But as soon as you asked them about the plan, it was immoral. And that more than half of the people in the country didn't like the plan, the whole plan, whereas everybody, like 80% of the people, liked all the provisions of it. The reason is that these two frames are in different parts of the brain. Frames are parts of the brain. They're in there. Everything you think is physical. Everything you think is in neural circuitry. And the neural circuitry for these things are just in different places. And people think about them really differently in different contexts. The Obama administration did not understand this. And they still don't, unfortunately. But you do. And that's important, because it's important that we explain this, and we're going to go through this in a lot of detail. Now, the conservatives have an advantage. And the advantage is interesting because they know how to use the contemporary work on cognitive science and neuroscience, whereas the Democrats tend not to. And what happens is that liberal discourse, on the whole, tends to use an outdated theory of reason itself. A huge amount has been discovered about how people really reason, what real reason is. And instead, liberal Democrats, for an interesting reason, don't tend to think in terms of what has been discovered scientifically in the cognitive and neural sciences. Instead, they think in a very different, outmoded way. And there's a very interesting reason for this. Conservatives going to places like Berkeley and other universities often study business. And in the business curriculum, they study marketing. And marketing professors have to know how people really think. And so conservatives know about marketing, and they learn about how people think in terms of images, metaphors, emotionality, etc. And however, people who are liberals going to places like Berkeley tend to study something else. They tend to study, if they want to go into politics, political science, economics, law, public policy, and they don't study marketing, and they don't study cognitive science. As a result, they learn a different theory and theory of reason, a kind of outmoded theory of reason. And let's talk about what's in it. And you may have heard this theory because I was taught it at MIT many years ago. It says reason is conscious, that you know what you're thinking, that it's unemotional, that emotion gets in the way of reason, that reason fits the world. You can reason directly about the world. It says what makes us human beings is that we all have the same reason, that it's universal. And not only that, it's complete because it fits the world, and that means concepts are coming out of the world. We have all the concepts we need. And not only that, the way that we can formalize it is just the way Descartes and others did back in the 1600s, in symbolic terms as in mathematics. And that it's logical, that it works by mathematical logic, that it's and by the way, I believed this for a long time myself, that it is disembodied, that reason is not physical, because of course, as Descartes said, if it were physical, then you couldn't have free will, because the physics of the world would interfere with free will. So he says it has to be disembodied. And the idea that you have reason, its purpose is to serve your self-interest, and that language, therefore, since it fits the world, is neutral. Language is defined in terms of concepts, in terms of the world. I suspect many of you have seen some of these ideas. I trust that they're as familiar to you as they are to me. However, other things, and these are the properties. If you believe that, then you'll say that everybody's aware of what they believe, and if you just tell people the facts, they'll all reason to the right conclusion. How many times have you heard liberal Democrats give you statistics? Facts and facts and facts and facts. The assumption is we just tell people the facts, they'll reason to the right conclusion, right? Political communication is therefore educating the public about their interests. That is, what are your interests and what are the facts? That comes right out of that view. It says that everyone reasons the same way unless they're stupid or being deceptive. So if you're watching MSNBC, you will hear a discussion of the Republican debates in terms of either the stupidity or deceptiveness of the candidates, of which I will say nothing one way or the other. Now, the other assumption that will come out of this is about morality, that there's one morality, it's universal, and it's rational. that emotion gets in the way of reason, that you shouldn't be emotional. Emotion gets in the way of reason. And we have access to all the ideas that we need, and that language is neutral. These are the implications of that old theory. The new account of reason is really different. And it says, look, thought is physical. It's carried out by neural circuitry in the brain. You think with your brain. You have no choice. One wonders about certain political leaders, but, you know, even they presumably think with their brains. We wonder what other parts of their anatomy they might be using sometimes. But mostly they think with their brains. 98% of thought turns out to be unconscious. Consciousness is tiny. It's the tip of the thought iceberg. Most thought is unconscious, and it has to be for a simple reason. The neural circuitry of your brain works in parallel, vast parallelisms. Consciousness is linear. There's no way in which most of the things you think could conceivably be linear. It's mostly unconscious. Okay? Very important thing to know. Next, rationality requires emotion. This is an interesting discovery. There's a great book by Tony Damasio called Descartes' Error. And Tony had a very interesting career. He's now at USC, but for years he was at the University of Iowa. And Iowa had an interesting policy. Whenever anybody had a major stroke or a brain injury, the state of Iowa would send a helicopter to pick them up and fly them to Tony, who was head of the neuroscience department at the University of Iowa. And he would, studied thousands and thousands of people over 20 years at the University of Iowa. And among them were people who had strokes that happened to hit a certain part of the brain that kept them from feeling emotion. These folks could not feel emotion. Now, imagine that you could not feel emotion, that you had such a stroke. Would you be super rational like Mr. Spock on Star Trek? No. And the reason is, if you can't feel emotion, you don't know what to like. You don't know what to want. You can't set goals, and you can't tell if anybody else would like or not like what you're going to do. And so you wind up doing random things and screwing up your life. Right? Reason requires emotion in order to set goals, in order to understand what other people will think of you. Otherwise, you can't function in any rational way. Crucial fact about reason. It's embodied. One of the things we have shown is that the actual structure of concepts comes out of various, not just physical things about your body, but how you act, how you perceive, what your emotional structure is, all sorts of structures in the brain. And you can see this in the study of what's called embodied cognition. Let me give you a simple example. There's a general metaphor that we all learn that affection is warmth. He's a warm person, a cold person, and so on. And why do we have that metaphor? We have it because when you're held as a child and you feel affection from your parents, you also feel the warmth of their bodies together. And this is, we learn a metaphor system because two parts of the brain in different places are activated at once. And when they're activated over and over again, they get stronger together. And they spread, each neuron's connected to 10,000 others, and it takes, a couple of dozen to a couple of hundred neurons to do anything at all. So they spread through existing pathways, and then they get stronger. And then they spread further, and they get stronger until the shortest pathway is found. And that pathway forms a circuit. That circuit is the metaphor of that affection is warmth. That metaphorical thought works that way for what we'll call embodied metaphors, simple primary metaphors. You learn hundreds of them before you ever learn language. Hundreds. It shapes the way you understand the world. Now, what's crucial about this is very important. There are experiments done that go something like this. John Barge at Yale brings in a bunch of subjects to the lab, And in what is supposed to be before the experiment, they give half of the subjects warm coffee. It's cold at Yale. They give them warm coffee or cold coffee. Okay? Then they bring them in and they say, okay, now we're going to start the experiment. Imagine you've just met some person. Describe the person you've met. And statistically, the people who've had the warm coffee describe friendly people. And the people with the cold coffee describe unfriendly people. Surprise, surprise. Other cases, he'll bring in a bunch of subjects, and he'll say, okay, go in and meet all these other people and tell half of them, go whisper something nasty about someone else in their ears, and the other one say something nice to these people in their ears. Half and half. Then on the way out, they give them a choice. Oh, we'll give you a little prize. You can either get a pencil or a handy wipe. Guess who takes the handy wipes? The people who did the nasty things. Right? That is, it's called the Lady Macbeth effect. But the reason is, we have a metaphor that morality is purity. And the reason is, you have a sense of well-being when you eat pure food, and a sense of ill-being when you eat rotten food. And therefore, you get a metaphor of, pure as the driven snow versus something's rotten in the state of Denmark. Right? Yeah, it was a rotten thing to do. So what's happening is that those metaphorical circuits in your brain can govern behavior. They can govern what you do. And there are now hundreds of experiments that have been showing this over and over again. Now, so reason is embodied. Concepts and reason arise from circuitry. And this is a really important one. The same brain circuitry is used for imagination as well as doing. So when you see something, certain parts of the brain are active. When you imagine seeing something, the same parts are active. When you perform an action, like kicking or eating or punching or writing something, right? That same parts are active as when you imagine performing that action. That is, imagination and works the same way as actually doing, crucially. That is, and now that also is true not only when you imagine, it's true when you dream, when you remember, anything like that, and when you hear language. That is, when you hear language about kicking or something like that, the part of the brain that has to do with kicking will light up. That doesn't mean you actually kick, because part of your brain down here will keep you from actually kicking, but you'll imagine kicking, and you can see in fMRI studies that part of the brain will be active. So this is important. And lastly, a big deal, mirror neuron circuitry. Mirror neurons were discovered in 1996 in Parma, Italy. And it was very simple and interesting things. They were studying monkeys, macaque monkeys, and they had probes down into the monkey's brain, single neuron, looking at the premotor cortex that choreographs actions. They had single neuron probes down there to see what neurons were firing when the monkeys did certain things like pressing bars and eating bananas and, crunching peanuts and things like that. So one day, they're doing the experiment, it's running fine, the computer is turned on, it goes click, 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 click when it's running, and the guy running the experiment, who now is a close friend, went out for lunch, came back, hadn't had dessert, picked up a banana, and he heard click, 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 click. But the computer wasn't tied to him, it was tied to the monkey. Turns out that when they analyzed what was going on with the monkey, it was the banana peeling part of the brain. That is, they found out as they studied it that there were parts of the premotor cortex which would be active when you either performed an action or you saw someone else perform the same action. And this wasn't a miracle, because those were connected to the parietal cortex just behind, which integrates vision and sound and so on. So it was not at all surprising that this would happen once you understood it, but it happens. Well, it turns out that those regions where you are moving and moving muscles in your body are connected to the emotional regions. As Paul Ekman has found out beginning in the 1950s, there's a physiology of emotions. And so when you see someone else and you see their bodies, you can tell if someone's writhing in pain, you can feel their pain. You can tell if someone is happy, you can see that they're smiling and that they're happy, they're showing happiness, and so on. This is the basis of empathy. Empathy is physical. That's the discovery. And it's not just empathy, it's also, there's another set of neurons called the canonical neurons for canonical actions that you perform with things. Like you see a banana, you'll peel the banana, or something like that. That's a canonical action. Turns out, when you see an object, the same neurons are firing as when you perform a canonical action on such an object. And this links you to the physical world and to nature. We are hardwired to connect emotionally with other people and to connect with nature. Great discovery. And it is not the case that reason is just about self-interest. It's as much about connection to other people and to the world as it is about anything to do with self-interest. Very important thing to understand about the nature of reason. Now, then there is the mechanisms. There are things called cogs, or cognitive primitives, simple things like spatial relations, above, below, inside, outside, source, path, and a goal, to and from, things like that for spatial relations and other relations. There are structures called frames, which we've been talking about, and think of something, and metaphors. And my favorite examples of this from politics are things like tax relief, which you still hear all the time. It was introduced on the first day that George Bush took office. He talked about tax relief unendingly. If you think about it, relief has a frame. It says there's an affliction that is harming you, that there's somebody who can take, or something that can take that affliction away, and that's a good thing. And if somebody tries to stop them, then that's bad because they're keeping the affliction going. They're keeping the harm going. Taxation, you add that, and you get taxation is an affliction. That's a conservative idea. So that the term tax relief fits conservative morality and conservative ideology. It's not neutral language at all in any way. And we reason in terms of frames and metaphors of all sorts, and you'll see lots of them as we go along. We also reason in terms of narratives. And there are structures of narrative that then get applied politically in all over the place. Take a simple narrative, the hero-villain narrative. Okay? It has a very simple structure. It says, at first, there are certain people in this. There's a hero, a villain, a victim, maybe helpers of various kinds. And then there are stages. First, the villain does something despicable to a victim, who may or may not be the hero himself. Then the hero encounters the villain, and there's some struggle or fight. We don't know who's going to win. Now, when you have this, you get emotions as well. The hero does something despicable. How do you feel to some victim? You feel angry. When you feel hurt for the victim. When the hero encounters the villain and you don't know who's going to win, you feel anxious. You feel fearful. When the hero wins, you feel triumphant, happy. Every single time. The emotions are structurally built into the structure of the narrative via circuitry, and Tony Damasio and his wife Hannah have traced what that circuitry is. Right? We know that there is circuitry for that. And this is very common. Then you can have hero-villain stories about why to start a war in Iraq, for example. You're going to rescue the people of Iraq, or other kinds of hero-villain stories every time you see a detective story on TV, and so on. You're going to get hero-villain narratives about politics constantly, and other kinds of things. Rags to riches narratives that are constantly used in politics to show how people had simple beginnings and rose and so on because they were sort of moral. You get the idea. We have narratives that have emotions built in, and then they apply metaphorically to things like politics and many other aspects of life. So that's how reasoning really works. And it's important to understand that that's how it works, because that's real reason, and it's rational. When we are reasoning and we have rationality, we have to use emotions, we have to use the narratives we have, and all of those are in our brains. You can't function without using the way your brains are structured. And your brains are structured to think that way. Each of these things, narratives have implications. They have a logic. Frames have a logic. Metaphors have a logic. It's not like you think without any logic. It's that you don't think with just mathematical logic. You go way beyond that. You think with this kind of logic. Now, what's interesting is there are other properties of this. If you negate a frame, you activate the frame. Very simple. I wrote a book called Don't Think of an Elephant. Ready? Don't think of an elephant, guys. Right? You activate elephant. Nixon got up and said, "I am not a crook." Right? Barack Obama, in that speech, got up and said, "This is not a government takeover. We're going to end the following bad practices." And then he gives the list of the practices. Right? Same issue. If you negate a frame, you activate the frame. Conservatives are taught in institutes for training them, in training institutes, never to use the other side's language, even to negate it. Got it? We'll come back to that in a minute. There's a very important phenomenon called hypocognition, which we're going to talk about a lot. Hypocognition is the lack of ideas we need. And this was first brought up in the 1950s when there was a clinical psychologist who went to get a PhD in anthropology, went to Tahiti, and took up the problem of why there were so many suicides in Tahiti. And what he discovered was that there was no concept of grief in the language or the culture, and no way to deal with grief. That people understood when someone died or something awful happened, that demons were after you, or that you were deathly ill. That the feeling of grief was that kind of thing, and that wouldn't go away. And people committed suicide at very high rates. Right? They had hypocognition. They needed a concept of grief and a way to deal with grief. They didn't have it. What you're going to see is that the Democratic Party has a lot of hypocognition these days. There's a lot of it in our culture, and there are reasons for it, and it's very, very important as an idea. The other thing to know is that every word in every language is defined relative to a frame structure. If you take a word like surgeon, it is a surgery frame. And you know that the surgeon operates on somebody in an operating room using stuff like scalpels and so on. And there are certain things that are not in that frame. Monkey wrenches, hopefully, are not in that frame. Pineapple trees are not in that frame, etc. There are things that are not in that frame, and things that are. That is, they are conceptual structures that you use to think, and every word is defined with respect to them, discovered here at Berkeley by Chuck Fillmore, one of my colleagues. Then there are what are called contested concepts and word meanings. And what's interesting about that is that I've written a whole book on this for the word freedom, inspired by George W. Bush. In his second inaugural address, he used the words freedom, free, and liberty 49 times in 20 minutes. And the question is, what did those words mean? And it turns out that about half of the time he was using common meanings of freedom, and half of the time he was using a conservative version that was very weird to me and other progressives, and that progressives had a totally different version of freedom that he wasn't using at all. And this is very important. So to maintain our freedom, he said, we have to be able to spy on everybody, etc. There are lots of things like that about arguing for freedom. And in order to show how this works in the notion free market and so on, well, we'll talk about that in a while, you need to understand how conservatism and progressivism apply to those cases. So these are things that we know about this. We know that frames form hierarchies. Very important. All political frames have a moral basis. And this is something a lot of people don't realize. All politics is moral. And the way you can see this is just think about the following. Have you ever heard a politician get up and say, do what I say, follow this policy because it's wrong, because it's evil. Do it. They don't say do it because it's right, but they have different concepts of what's right. That is, they have different moral systems. And that's very important to understand. All politics is about some moral system, and all political policies and frames are framed within a hierarchical structure where the highest part of that hierarchy is the moral system itself. And that's absolutely crucial if you're going to understand this. Now, this is a very important fact, and I got into the study of all of this back in 1994 when I read The Contract with America. And in that, as a cognitive scientist, I asked myself the following question. I said, gee, as a liberal, I didn't understand The Contract with America because I said, look, these are funny people. Why are the same people against abortion and against taxation? What do abortion and taxation have to do with each other? They're against unions and worker rights. What does that have to do with abortion? They're against environmentalism. What does that have to do with taxation? They're for laissez-faire markets, for the use of military strength, for corporate personhood, tort reform, etc. You know, what do these issues have to do with each other? Why should they fit together? And I have exactly the opposite views on every one of them. So I said, how do mine fit together? And I got very embarrassed because even though this was my field, I had no idea. And so I started doing research in cognitive science, and the book Moral Politics came out of that. And what I discovered when I started looking at the notion of family values is that one of my students had written a paper on the nation as family metaphor. We have founding fathers. We send our sons and daughters to war. We have homeland security. We don't want missiles in our backyard, etc. Okay? Well, okay, what's going on there? It turns out that there are two different models of the family that form the basis of two different political ideologies. One of them is what I call a strict father family. It's sort of the father knows right from wrong, and the father is the ultimate authority. In a strict father family, no one has more authority than the father, and the father must maintain his authority by force if necessary. So if he's challenged by kids, he's got to punish the kids, etc. And the father protects, not projects, and supports the family. Children learn morality by being punished when they're wrong for disobedience. Morality is obedience. Punishment is morally required. If you read the books on child rearing, it says, you know, you have to punish your child when he does wrong because that shows love. And it shows morality. If you don't punish, you're being immoral and you're hurting your children. You're not bringing them up right. Morality requires discipline. So if you're undisciplined, you can't be moral. Okay? So and all responsibility is personal responsibility. You know, you get to heaven because of what you do. You know? And the idea here is every adult is responsible for satisfying their own interests. Now, this has a logic. It says, you know, in this wonderful country where we have free enterprise, if you are disciplined financially, fiscally, you can make money. You can become prosperous. So what if you're not prosperous? It means you're not disciplined. If you're not disciplined, you can't be moral and you deserve your poverty. Right? You've heard this before. Very common conservative logic. It's the logic of the strict father family applied to economics. And there's another very important thing about the father is the ultimate authority in the family, and that authority must be maintained. Think about the free market for a minute. Have you ever heard the expression, let the market decide? The market is the decider. You've heard that one too, right? That is, the market is seen as a kind of strict father who is moral and natural. Why is the market natural? Because greed is natural, according to this. It's about self-interest. Why is the market moral? because if everybody pursues their own greed, their own self-interest, presumably, everybody's self-interest will be maximized by the invisible hand. So it's moral. In addition to that, it says there should be nothing above the market. If the market is the decider and is moral and natural, there shouldn't be anything above it, like the government. Well, what would be above it? Regulation, taxation, unions and worker rights, tort reform, and any use of science that goes against the market. Not just any use of science, because science can be fine if you're drilling in the Gulf, but use of science that goes against the market is immoral. What you have is all the things that conservatives believe about the market follow from understanding the strict father view of the world applied to the market. And it's a very different view of the market than progressives have, where the market is there to serve society and help people, as well as to make money for people. So those are really different views, and they come from different views of the family. So the nurturant parent family has two parents of equal responsibility. How do they gain respect from their children? They earn it by showing how they live. They have open communication. The strict father family says, the father says, the kid does no backtalk. This is different. Parents use and teach empathy and responsibility for yourself and others, social as well as personal responsibility. And parents are responsible for their children's well-being. And as Hillary says, it takes a village. You don't just raise your children by yourself. They're raised in a community. Right? When you take this and apply it to politics, what you get is a version of progressive politics. And this is very interesting. So it says a governing institution is a family, and this is how this works. But what's really interesting from neuroscience is the understanding of why it is possible for some people to be conservative about some things and progressive about other things. That's normal. Happens all the time. You can be, and notice it's all possible kinds of things. So you can be conservative about financial issues and progressive about social issues, or the reverse. You can be conservative about foreign policy and progressive about domestic policy, and all kinds of things in between. Lots and lots of possibilities. There is no, and by the way, people who have both views like this are called either moderates, centrists, or independents, right? But what's interesting is there is no one ideology behind this because it's a combination of two. They're conservative about some things, progressive about other things. There's no one ideology of the moderate. There's no one ideology of the center. There's no one ideology of independence. You have combinations of these things. Now, how is this possible in a single brain? If you have two moral systems and two views of the family that are contradictory, that don't fit together, how is it possible? It's very simple. One of the basic things about brains is that they have structures called mutual inhibition. Mutual inhibition is when one circuit inhibits the other and the second circuit inhibits the first. It says when one is active, the other is inactive. This has a consequence. It says when one is more active over and over, it gets stronger and the other gets weaker. Now, if you want a non-political example of the case where people have two moral systems, don't even know that they have them as different moral systems, and they switch between them without noticing, just think of Saturday night and Sunday morning morality. Okay? Very different things. Saturday night, great time. Sunday morning, go to church. Right? Fine. Right? Most people don't notice that different parts of the brain are being used. It's their mutual inhibition. The same thing is true for people who are partly conservative and partly progressive in all kinds of different ways. And that's important for the following reason politically. It's important because if you want to convince people who are like this, independents, centrists, and by the way, a very large portion of our population consists of independents, and they're the most important part of the population in voting in any election. You want to get the independence. What does that mean? It means if you use your language to evoke your moral system, it will be strengthened, right? If you use the other side's language, your side will be weakened. So conservatives are taught in training institutes never to use the language of the other side. Liberals have the other idea. They think, oh, we should use their language, since it's kind of neutral, to talk to them, to converse, to have good conversations, and so on. And to convince them, we have to use their language, and therefore they shoot themselves in the foot by saying exactly the thing that will be worst. And this happens a great deal. It's called moving to the right, using centrist talk, using centrist policies, centrist language. That's what happens. You never see conservatives moving to the left. And there's a reason. They're trained that way. Very important fact about how the brains work. Now, we've talked about this. And what this does is give you this difference in worldview, give you two very different views about what democracy is. In the progressive view, there's a view that says democracy in America is based on a single moral principle. Citizens care about one another and act responsibly on that care, both individual and social responsibility. By the way, Obama, during his campaign, was asked by Anderson Cooper, what is your view of patriotism? And his response was, patriotism begins with people caring about each other. Very interesting. And he talked about empathy, until he got attacked for using the word empathy. But what's important here is that this is part of the progressive view of what democracy is. It says there's a role of government, and that role of government is to empower and protect all citizens equally. And that has a consequence. It says it requires a robust sense of the public. And that sense of the public provides infrastructure, education, health protection, safety nets, government research, market oversight, economic stability, sewers, all sorts of very practical things, clean air, clean water, and on and on. You can feel, I had a session in class where we went through all the things that were public. It took an hour and a half to just list them, right? The point is that nobody makes it on their own in this country without the public. That to have a vital private, you have to have a robust public. This is something Elizabeth Warren has been saying recently, but it's a basic truth about the nature of this country. And it's often not talked about. Freedom requires a robust public. Think about it for a minute. If you didn't have roads and bridges, if you didn't have an education, if you didn't have health protections of various kinds, if you didn't have any kind of advanced research or technology, if you didn't have any market oversight at all or economic stability, the country would be sort of like the Congo, be a very different thing, and you wouldn't have the kind of freedoms that you now enjoy. Freedom, as we know it in America, requires a robust sense of the public, and that is what allows private individuals to use their innovative ideas, to use their creativity, to make money, create new industries, and so on. That is what is necessary. And there's a moral obligation that goes with it to give something back. Now, that is the conservative view the progressive view of democracy in America. The conservative view is very different. It says democracy is based on a different moral principle: the freedom of citizens to seek their own interests regardless of the interests of others. Those who succeed deserve to, those who don't succeed don't deserve to. And this principle imposes a moral hierarchy, which should be reflected in political and economic power. The people who are more moral will succeed, they're more disciplined, they deserve to, they should rule. Right? Very simple thing. Two totally different ideas. Now, let's apply this to a recent phenomenon called the Occupy movement. And what's interesting about the Occupy movement, to me at least, is this. When you start talking to folks who are in encampments or listening to them in various places, you find that what they're saying is not just about economics, though it is about economics. When it's about economics, they have hundreds of economic complaints, all of them, I think, reasonably legitimate, all sorts of economic ideas by the hundreds, but they're also concerned about the environment. They're concerned about social justice. They're concerned about equality, and not just income inequality, but inequality of all sorts. They're concerned about issues of war and peace. In short, they have a bunch of concerns, and they have hundreds of these specific concerns. But they all come down to one concern. The Occupy movement has the progressive view of democracy as a general principle. You care about your fellow citizens, you act on that care, you have a government that empowers and protects all people equally, and you have a robust public. That took 10 seconds to say, right? That is the general principle that is behind that, and behind supporters, not just people in encampments. They're against what follows from the conservative view of democracy, which is democracy is what allows you the freedom to just seek your self-interest and ignore the interests of anybody else. And that if you succeed, you deserve to, and other people who don't deserve to. Okay? If you start listening to what they see as wrong and what they see as right, those are the principles. Now, they don't say it. Remember, 98% of thought is unconscious. They're guided by unconscious principles, but there they are. They could be said, but they're not conscious, and they're not being said. Now, right now, the Occupy movements are being broken up in various cities. LA and Philadelphia just broke up encampments. The encampments are going, winter is coming, and so on. So the question is asking what's next. And I think what's next for many people, not everybody in the Occupy movement, is occupying elections. And occupying elections is a very important thing. And I want to say one more thing. If you actually go talk to people who are in the encampments, many of them would never dream of being in the electoral system. Now, occupying elections has to do with people who mainly are behind it, but not necessarily everybody in the encampments. The Occupy movement has broad support. In the 40th percentile right now in California, 58% support the ideas behind it. That's a huge amount, if you think about it, for 2 months of work. And there are people there who say, no, I will never have anything to do with any party, but other people who say, you know, well, we need to change the world. Well, one thing that people who have the skills to organize encampments, to organize food for them, to organize safety, to organize security, to organize sanitation, to organize general assemblies every day, and that work. Those are the skills needed in campaigns, right? So think about the Democratic Party for a minute. Imagine if all the folks who were interested in the Occupy movement and who were not against doing anything in government, and we'll talk about those who are in a minute, suppose they all joined a Democratic club and insisted on campaigning, but only for those people who believe in that one principle, right? That's a huge amount. Now, if any of you have ever been to a Democratic club, you'll notice that there's a lack of manpower. Very important. They need people. What do they need people for? They need people to register voters, to give out pamphlets, to knock on doors, to talk to people, to call up talk shows, to bring people to the polls. They need people for dozens and dozens and dozens of tasks. Now, when you talk to folks in the Occupy movement who have no hope in the Democratic or Republican parties, one of the things they'll say is, well, both parties are run by money, by Wall Street, so why should we bother? And there's a very interesting response to that. What does money buy you in an election? Money buys you people working. And for Democrats, that's what the money is used for, to get people who will go out and knock on doors and do pamphlets and do voter registration and take people to the polls, and do internet blogging and so on. That is, money buys you people, but if you have people, enough of them, you don't need that money. And that's important to understand. And it's very important for folks who support the Occupy movement to understand that there is a way to change our country. And that there is a single message and a single idea behind all of it. One idea, very simple one, and it's about the nature of democracy. Now, here's what progressives are up against, and it's not small. Conservatives have a 40-year jump on us, and let me try to give you a sense of what has happened in the last 40 years or more. In 1967, 3 years after Goldwater lost with 37% of the vote, Richard Nixon ran for the presidency, and he had a problem. The problem was, how do you get working people in America who saw themselves as liberals to vote for Nixon? Okay? Lee Atwater and Roger Ailes addressed this problem. And they noticed three important things about working people in America. They noticed that between 64 and 67, three important things had changed. First, there was an anti-war movement from the universities, and a lot of working people had been in the military and were very horrified by the anti-war movement, which they saw as anti-military, and so Nixon ran on anti-communism. Second, a lot of them, people who were working people, were upset by the feminist movement, especially radical versions of the feminist movement that had arisen between 64 and 67. And so Nixon ran on traditional family values. And then the civil rights movement and the civil rights legislation occurred in 65. And a lot of working men, especially in the South and many in the North, were threatened by African Americans taking their jobs, or some of them were racists. And so what they did was Nixon ran on anti-school busing and on law and order. Right? So in doing so, they formed conservative populism. But they needed to go and attack liberalism. And they did it with an idea, the idea of the liberal elite. That is, liberals are these fancy pants people who don't have any real understanding of the world and who are the limousine liberals, the latte liberals. I had my cappuccino before. The people who want to tax and spend, the tax and spend liberals, etc. The sushi-eating, Birkenstock-wearing, etc. liberals who look down on working people. Now, they've been saying this since 1967 without anything from the liberals answering back. Why? But in that time, they've created conservative populism, which has grown into the Tea Party. Okay. Now, the second part is the communication system. In 1971, Lewis Powell, who was the chief counsel for the major business or lobbying organization in America, the Chamber of Commerce, just before he was appointed to the Supreme Court by Nixon, Lewis Powell wrote a memo. And the memo said to the Chamber of Commerce, we've got a problem. The best and brightest of our students do not want to become conservative businessmen. That's a disaster. Here's what we have to do about it. We have to get rich conservatives together and do the following. First, endow professorships of conservative business practices in major universities. Okay? The Olin professorships, for example. Set up institutes for the study of conservative business practices in major universities and support the ones that are already there, like the Olin Institute at Harvard and the Hoover Institution at Stanford and so on. But it said, they went on, he said, we can't trust the universities. We have to build our own research institutions, which have come to be the think tanks. And what we have to do is hire the best conservative intellectuals we can find. We have to support them well. We have to get them the best research equipment, the best research people we can get. We have to organize them. We have to give them facilities, and we have to make sure they can publish. We have to start magazines. We have to start publishing companies, and we have to buy media so they can go on the medium, on media and get out there. In addition, we need to train spokespeople all over the country to get our ideas out there. We need training institutes to train people how to think and talk in our values. All right? Very important. And we need to be able to book them on the media and in public venues. We need booking agencies. Go to the web if you want to see it. Look up Lewis Powell memo, and you'll find it. This was carried out beginning in 1971, and by the 1990s, there were 80 think tanks and a huge structure that did all of this. Fox News is just the tip of the iceberg. Fox News only has 2 or 3 million people watching. That's small compared to what the communication system does. In this time, okay, so that's part of it. Under Reagan, with the help of James Dobson of the Family Research Council, they integrated the idea of conservatives. Conservatives used to hate each other. They found out how to begin to come together around a single idea, which is strict father conservatism. And then the Gingrich Revolution, starting in 1994, basically said, we have to get rid of all of these moderates in the Republican Party. We have to make it purely conservative, and we have to stop talking to liberals. We have to separate it out. We have to go home on weekends, not hang around Washington having parties with liberals. We have to stop, just break period with that. Something that Barney Frank recently said when he announced his retirement. And with all of this together, you have the situation we have now. Very important thing. Now, this gives us a huge job. The conservatives have a framing advantage. They have a guy named Frank Luntz, who's smart, and who does a lot of framing for them. He came up with things like partial birth abortion, government takeover, etc. And we have a problem of progressive hypocognition. Over the past 40 years, conservatives have created a conservative public discourse, which has come to be what the news media now says. It's standard public discourse, and we'll give you examples momentarily. Reframing is not simple. It's not just finding a few nice words and saying them. It's not a matter of getting some slogans. A lot of liberals think, oh, if we just found the right words, by next Tuesday we could do this. I call this the next Tuesday problem for the following reason. My wife and I were once about to take a plane to New York, and 5 minutes before we boarded, it was on a day when Congress was considering major environmental legislation, and it looked like it was about to go down. I got a call from the head of the major environmental committee in Congress. And he said, oh, George, we need you right now. Can you reframe the environment by next Tuesday? Sorry. Because this isn't a matter of just some words. It has to do with the conceptual system that is there, and it has to do with filling up the gaps given by hypocognition. It's a huge and important job because the other guys have been at it for 40 years. That's why it's so easy for them. They've been building this, and in doing it, they've changed people's brains because every one of those ideas are physically in people's brains. And it's hard to get around that. So what you have is we have to create stories and language that have to be repeated over and over. Now, why do things have to be repeated over and over? Because the more than an idea that a neural circuit is activated, the stronger it gets in your brain. That's why you hear conservatives say the same thing over and over and over and over. They're trained to do that. Use the same language. It's going to change people's brains, and it does. Whereas liberals think, oh, if we just say it once, people will get the idea, and it'll be okay, right? Tell them the facts. Now, it just isn't like that. And then, so the question is, what is the form of hypocognition that has to be addressed by progressives. And it's huge if you start. What kind of stories have to be told? Well, we began to do some of it tonight. There's the story of the public and the private. You know, it's the story that says, here's what the public gives you. You know, all of these things. And to have anything that's private at all, you have to have a robust public. But it's more than that, because part of it has to do with the concept of taxes. Now, taxes have, over the past 40 years, changed their meaning. In 1964, when Johnson won, people had no problem paying taxes. Taxes were what you did to get a reasonable society. But that changed. It changed to the idea that taxes are what government takes out of the pockets of hardworking people and gives to people that don't deserve them. That's the new definition of taxes. And that's in people's brains. And that has to be changed. And it has to be changed along with the concept of the public and the private. Secondly, you have the notion of privatization. Well, what is privatization about? You have a view that private corporations are very efficient. Anybody ever been in a private corporation? How many of them are really efficient? Right? Most private corporations are as inefficient as government is, or as most other institutions are. You know, they're not necessarily efficient. Moreover, which governs your life more? The federal government or all the corporations in America? Corporations govern your life. Think of your HMOs. They govern your health care. Media corporations govern the kind of news or entertainment you can watch. The corporations govern the kinds of goods you can buy, and so on. Start thinking about particular corporations and see how they govern your life. This is a story that has to be told. Private corporations govern your life not for your benefit, but for their profit. Now, that doesn't mean they don't give you benefit. They can give you benefit very well, but often the choices they give you are not necessarily the choices you want, as in HMOs, for example, and lots of other things, like cell phone companies. But think about it. Cell phone companies govern your choice of cell phones and of cell phone capacity and so on. So these are things that have to be changed if you're going to change the notion of the private and the public and the whole idea of what taxation is. Taxation has to do with revenue needed to run a reasonable society and to have any sort of notion of private life at all, and to have freedom. And that's important, because you can't be free without a robust notion of the public. So that's another part of this. Now let's see, where did I put that little thing? Yes, here it is. Then, this is a big one, and I haven't talked about it yet. Suppose I ask you, what are the major causes of crime? What are the causes of crime? Okay? If you ask a conservative, the answer is bad people, lock them up. If you ask most liberals, they'll say, well, there's poverty, lack of education, bad neighborhoods, lack of adequate parenting, etc. You get very different answers. One having to do with character and direct causation, and one having to do with systemic causation. And that's a very important fact and an important difference. The environment is all about systemic causation. Everything in an ecology is part of a system. You know? So, for example, what happens when there is a snowstorm, big snowstorm in Washington, D.C. in the winter? Conservatives say, no global warming, see? It snowed, right? Direct causation. But if you know anything about the weather, you know, for example, in the Pacific or in the Atlantic, you can have lots of, when it gets hot, I mean, when the earth gets hot, you get evaporation, it goes up, the winds blow them over the North Pole, they come down over the East Coast in snow in the winter because it's cold. That is, you're going to get extreme weather that way. If you have winds from the north coming that way and winds from the Gulf coming the other way, you'll get tornadoes in the Midwest. That is, you have systemic causation, both systemic causes of global warming, of all sorts of the list of causes you know, and systemic effects. If you don't know the difference between systemic and direct causation, you're not going to be able to reason about the environment or the economy or many other things. But linguists know something important about this. Every language in the world, in its grammar, has a way to characterize direct causation, usually in the morphology or in the syntax. No language in the world has a way in its grammar to characterize systemic causation. Systemic causation must be learned. Direct causation arises naturally from your everyday experience. That's a profound fact, a deep fact. And you can't just tell people facts about the environment, isolated facts, and have them put together into a systemic explanation if they don't know what systemic causation is. It's absolutely crucial. It's crucial in the economic system. One of the reasons that we have all the economic crises we've had is a lack of an understanding of the global economic system as a system. Absolutely crucial. We need to have that distinction known. That story has to be told over and over again about all sorts of things in society, which are systemic. Health is a systemic issue. It has to do with food. It has to do with transportation, people bringing disease from one part of the world to another. It has to do not only with health care, it has to do with old age and elder care. It has to do with many, many, many issues together as a system. It's not just the health care issue. It's the health system as a whole. It has to do with prevention. Lots of things in there. Education. Education is not just an individual issue. It's seen as either a right or a privilege that you pay for or something like that, but it's a moral imperative for society. And think of the following question. Do you want to live in a society where people know how to think and learn and have useful skills and have learned to care about each other, or not? Think about it for a minute. That is not a question about individual students. It is not a question about individual classrooms or teachers or teaching methods or tests or non-tests. It is about what a moral society is like. That is the central issue in education, and it was lost in Prop 209. That is, affirmative action, when it was brought in, had everything to do with the fact that the University of California has a moral imperative to provide to all of the constituencies and communities of all sorts in the state people who are educated, who have useful skills, who are doctors, who are lawyers, who know how to think, who are bankers, who are engineers, all sorts of educated people who know how to run businesses in every community. That was a major part of what affirmative action was originally about. When Prop 209 came, the liberals, I could not convince, I was brought in to talk to various liberal organizations about how to fight Prop 209. I wrote the argument, the faculty argument against 209 at Berkeley. And I could not convince any liberal organization to give that original argument. They all insisted on giving an individual argument on, do we have a level playing field? Well, all of a sudden, that's a losing argument because it's about individual self-interest and individual abilities. And as soon as you go there, then it's teaching to the test, then it's test scores, and you've lost. And you've lost because you've lost the essence of why we have public education in the first place. Okay? You've lost it. And if you're just talking about, how underprivileged people should be getting education so they could make more money in the market, you've lost. Because people will say, okay, well, they should take out loans and they make more money and then they'll pay it back, right? You've lost. But if you understand education as caring about what kind of society you have, it's a different argument. I'm going to stop there. I could go on probably for 3 hours, but I won't. Thank you.